The scent of polished marble and expensive cologne filled the air as Ethan Carter strode through the grand lobby of the Lancaster Hotel. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the velvet furnishings, and hushed voices of executives and high-profile guests murmured through the space. He barely noticed. His mind was occupied with a pending deal that would expand his empire yet again, another step toward cementing his name in the annals of wealth and power. He had worked for this, fought for this, sacrificed for this, but the moment he caught sight of her, everything else disappeared. At first, it was just a fleeting recognition, a glimpse of someone too familiar, too impossible to be here. He almost dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a ghost from a past he had locked away. Then she turned, and the air seemed to shift. Ava. His chest tightened. Ava Monroe. The woman he had once called his wife. But this wasn't the Ava he remembered. Gone was the confident, graceful woman who used to challenge him with a sharp wit and an unshakable spirit. The woman who once walked beside him as an equal, refusing to be swallowed by his world of deals and deadlines. This Ava stood in a crisp maid's uniform, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look smaller, wearier. She moved with quiet efficiency, wiping down tables, retrieving empty glasses, lowering her gaze when guests barely acknowledged her presence. A lump formed in his throat as he watched a businessman, his type of man, wave her off dismissively. Like she was invisible. She turned slightly, and for the briefest second their eyes met. Recognition. Shock. And then, something colder. A flicker of emotion, quickly extinguished. Ava looked away first. Ethan felt his pulse hammer against his temple. This didn't make sense. Their lives had diverged years ago. Their divorce had been ugly, final. He had signed papers, let the past die, moved forward without a backward glance. And yet, here she was, cleaning tables in a place where men like him barely noticed the help. His first instinct was to approach her, to demand answers. What happened to you? Why are you here? But his feet felt rooted to the marble floor. And then, as if fate had conspired to wound him deeper, another voice sliced through the air. Ava. How many times do I have to tell you? A sharp reprimand echoed across the lounge. A man in a stiff suit, the hotel manager, stalked toward her. You missed a spot. Are you even paying attention? Ethan watched, frozen, as Ava murmured an apology, head bowed, hands tightening around the cloth she held. The sight sent a cold fury rippling through him. This was wrong. The woman he had known would have snapped back, held her ground. Where had that Ava gone? And why did it feel like a part of him had just shattered? Years ago, Ethan had believed love was something that could be put on hold, stored away for later. He had been young, ambitious, obsessed with carving out his legacy. Ava had been his opposite. A dreamer, an artist at heart, someone who believed in love before wealth, in presence before power. She had met him when he was just another man with a vision, before he had millions at his disposal, before his name was whispered in rooms filled with industry giants. For a time, they built something beautiful, danced in their tiny apartment with no furniture, laughed over cheap takeout and whispered promises of a future where neither had to worry. Then the money came, and with it, the distance. Ethan worked harder, longer. Late nights turned into early mornings. Ava waited, and waited, until she stopped waiting altogether. She had begged him to see her, to remember what they had before his empire became his obsession. He had dismissed her concerns as temporary sacrifices. What was a little loneliness now compared to a future where they would have everything? But what he never understood, what she had tried to tell him over and over, was that everything meant nothing without love. The night she left, she hadn't screamed, hadn't thrown things, hadn't even cried. She had simply placed her wedding ring on the counter, next to the untouched dinner she had made, and walked out of his life. By the time he realized his mistake, she was gone. He never searched for her, never looked back. Until now. Ava felt Ethan's gaze like a weight pressing against her skin. It had been years since she last saw him. And yet, standing in this place, in this moment, she knew exactly what he was thinking. How did you end up here? If only he knew. The world after Ethan had not been kind. At first, she had been determined. She left with nothing but her dignity, believing she would build something new. But reality had different plans. A series of misfortunes, trusting the wrong people, losing the little she had saved, doors closing at every turn, had left her grasping at whatever survival offered. The job at the Lancaster was never meant to be permanent. But months had passed, then years, and the world kept moving while she remained stuck in place. She had no doubt Ethan felt pity. That was the worst part. She could endure hardship, struggle, even the degrading words of her manager. But his pity? The man who had once promised her the world, who had let her slip through his fingers without a fight. No. She would not allow him to see her as some tragic story. Squaring her shoulders, she turned away, forcing herself to focus on the next table, on the motions she had memorized. Polish, wipe, move. Behind her, Ethan took a step forward. She heard it, felt it, and yet she kept moving. He may have been her past, but she had already learned the hardest lesson. Some things were never meant to be reclaimed, and some wounds never truly healed. Ethan couldn't move. His body felt frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes were telling him. Ava, here as a maid. It was unthinkable, impossible, and yet it was real. The proof was in the way she moved, deliberate, mechanical, her head bowed just enough to make herself unseen, unnoticed. She had always carried herself with quiet strength, even in their worst fights. There was defiance in her, a fire that refused to be put out. But now, something was different. It wasn't just exhaustion on her face. It was something deeper. The weight of too many disappointments, too many battles lost. He clenched his fists, a storm rising inside him. How had her life unraveled to this? And why had he never thought to ask before? His feet finally obeyed, carrying him forward before he had time to question the decision. He was standing just a few steps behind her now, close enough to see the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she adjusted the tray in her hands. Ava. Her back stiffened. The pause was so brief that anyone else might have missed it. But Ethan saw. Slowly, she turned to face him. There was no shock this time, no surprise. It was as if she had already known he was there, watching. Her gaze lifted to his, and for a fleeting second, something unreadable flickered in her eyes. But just as quickly, she buried it beneath an expression so carefully composed, it made his stomach tighten. "Sir, I'm working, sir." The word felt like a slap, and she had known it would. She was setting the boundary before he could even take another step. He was no longer someone she knew. He was just another guest. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Ava, wait." But she had already turned away, deliberately, purposefully. A familiar voice interrupted the moment. "I swear, Ava, do you think you can take your time while we wait on you?" Ethan turned his head sharply. A man in a neatly pressed suit, wearing an expression that dripped with condescension, strode toward them. The hotel manager. Ava inhaled, shoulders pulling back, bracing. "I was just. You were just ignoring your duties. As usual." The man crossed his arms. "I don't know what you think this is, but you're here to clean, not stand around gawking at guests." The words sent a sharp pulse of anger through Ethan. Gawking? His gaze flicked to Ava, expecting to see defiance, but she said nothing. That was when Ethan realized just how much she had changed. The Ava he knew would have eviscerated this man with a single glare. Would have stood her ground, reminded him that no one had the right to speak to her that way. But this Ava? She only nodded, murmuring an apology before lowering her head. Something in Ethan cracked. The manager scoffed. "I swear, I don't know why we keep people like you around." That was it. Ethan took a step forward, his voice steel. "Excuse me." The manager barely glanced at him. "My apologies, sir. I'll have her out of your way. He turned to Ava. Get back to work. Ethan's patience snapped. You will not speak to her like that. The man finally gave him his full attention. His brows lifted slightly, as if only now recognizing who he was talking to. Sir, I didn't mean. You meant exactly what you said. Ethan's voice was calm but dangerous, the kind that made men rethink their choices. And I want to know why a member of your staff is being treated this way. The color drained from the manager's face. Mr. Carter, Ava cut in before Ethan could speak again. Ethan, don't. It was the first time she had said his name. He turned to her, but she was already looking at the manager. Her voice was quiet but firm. It's fine. I'll get back to work. And just like that, she walked away. Ethan stood there, hands clenched at his sides, rage still burning beneath his skin. But she had made her choice clear. She didn't want his help. It should have been enough to stop him. It wasn't. He turned to the manager, voice low and cutting. You're going to regret that. Then he walked away, not toward the exit but toward the front desk. Toward the people who actually mattered. He wasn't leaving. Not until he got answers. Ava's heart pounded as she disappeared down the hall, her hands gripping the tray so tightly her knuckles turned white. Why now? Why, after all these years, did he have to see her like this? She had barely kept herself together in front of him. The way he looked at her, shocked, pained, furious, it made her feel small in a way she despised. She wasn't ashamed of her work. She had done what she needed to survive. But to see Ethan, the man who had once promised her the world, staring at her as if she had become something broken, it made her stomach twist. She knew him well enough to know he wouldn't let this go. He had always been relentless, unwilling to lose, even in arguments that weren't worth winning. But he couldn't fix this. He had already let her go once. He needed to let her go again. Still, long after she returned to her duties, she could feel his presence lingering in the air. She knew this wasn't over. Ethan sat in the dimly lit corner of the Lancaster Hotel lounge, fingers tapping impatiently against the glass of whiskey in front of him. He had been here for hours, watching, waiting. Ava had been avoiding him. She had changed her route through the lounge, taken deliberate steps to ensure their paths didn't cross. But he saw her. Every careful movement, every moment she kept her head down, every time she swallowed her pride to endure the condescending treatment from both guests and management. It was eating him alive. He had spent the last decade commanding power, respect, and control. Yet, here he was, watching the woman he had once loved reduced to this, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it, unless she let him. And Ava had made it clear. She wouldn't. But he wasn't leaving without answers. Ava knew it too. So when the night finally wound down, when the last of the guests retired to their suites, and she emerged from the back to wipe down the bar one last time, he seized his moment. Ava. Her shoulders tensed. She could pretend she hadn't heard him. Could keep up the charade that he was just another guest, another fleeting moment in her night. But they both knew better. Slowly, she exhaled and turned to face him. You're still here. He studied her, the quiet exhaustion in her voice, the carefully measured tone. And you've been avoiding me. She gave a small, humorless laugh. I thought maybe if I ignored you long enough, you'd disappear. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Not a chance. A flicker of something crossed her face. Annoyance, maybe even regret. What do you want, Ethan? I want to know what the hell happened to you. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, he thought she might walk away again. Instead, she turned back to the bar, placing a glass down with more force than necessary. What does it matter? His frustration boiled over. It matters because I know you, Ava. You shouldn't be here. She let out a slow breath. Maybe this is where I belong. He recoiled slightly, stunned by the quiet defeat in her voice. This wasn't the woman who once fought for everything. Ava, his voice softened. Tell me what happened. She wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, as if choosing her words carefully. Life happened, Ethan. I walked away from our marriage with nothing, and I had to figure it out on my own. I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people. I lost everything I had left. And now, she gestured vaguely at the empty lounge. This is what's left. His chest tightened. Why didn't you come to me? She turned to him then, eyes flashing with something sharp. Because you were never there when it mattered. The words cut deeper than he expected. He opened his mouth, but she shook her head. You think showing up now makes a difference? That you can swoop in and fix everything? His silence was answer enough. She sighed. I don't need saving, Ethan. The words were meant to push him away, to end the conversation. But Ethan wasn't done. Is that really what you think? He stood, closing the space between them. That I just want to fix you like some problem to solve? She didn't step back, but her expression wavered for the first time. I don't know what you want. Her voice was quieter now. Ethan hesitated. Did he even know? For years, he had convinced himself that Ava was part of his past. A chapter closed, a wound healed. But seeing her now, seeing how much she had lost, it undid something inside him. He couldn't just walk away. Not this time. I want to help. Ava searched his face, something unreadable flickering behind her gaze. But before she could respond, a voice sliced through the air. Miss Monroe, what exactly do you think you're doing? The manager. Again. Ethan turned slowly, fists already clenching. The man's face was tight with irritation as he glanced between them. I don't recall giving you permission to take breaks for socializing. Ava stiffened. I was finishing up my shift. Not fast enough. The manager's lips curled. If you spend half as much effort working as you do talking, you might actually be competent at your job. Ethan saw red. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. Watch your mouth. The manager blinked, clearly not expecting the interruption. Excuse me. Ethan's voice was low, controlled. Dangerous. You heard me. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that made bystanders uneasy. The manager's confidence wavered for a moment, but he quickly straightened his posture. I don't know who you think you are, sir, but I will not be spoken to like this. Ethan smiled. It wasn't friendly. Oh, I think you will. The manager swallowed. He must have realized by now exactly who Ethan was. The name Ethan Carter carried weight in this city, and the manager suddenly looked like a man realizing he had made a mistake. You're done here. Ethan's voice was ice. Effective immediately. The manager's mouth opened and closed, floundering. You can't just… Ethan pulled out his phone, typing something swiftly. I own controlling shares in this hotel. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. You're fired. Silence fell over the lounge. The manager paled. You're joking. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Try me. The man sputtered, looking to Ava as if expecting her to defend him. She only stared, wide-eyed. Finally, the manager muttered something under his breath before turning on his heel and disappearing into the back. Ethan turned to Ava, expecting gratitude, relief, something. Instead, she looked at him like he had just made things worse. Ava, why did you do that? He frowned. Are you serious? That man was I could have handled it. Her voice was tight. Now you've just made me a target. Ethan's frustration boiled over. A target? Ava, he was treating you like garbage. You shouldn't have to take that. She shook her head, running a hand through her hair. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. She hesitated. But before she could say anything, another voice echoed from the doorway. Ava. A young girl peeked into the lounge, her wide brown eyes scanning the room before locking onto Ava. Ethan's breath caught. The girl couldn't have been older than 6, and she looked just like Ava. His mind raced, pieces clicking together too fast to process. Ava's face drained of color. She turned to the girl, voice soft. Sweetheart, what are you doing here? The child glanced at Ethan curiously before stepping closer to Ava. I woke up and you weren't home. Ethan's world tilted. His gaze snapped back to Ava. She looked away. And that was when Ethan finally understood. This wasn't just about her. This was about the child. His voice was barely a whisper. Ava, is she mine? Ava's silence was deafening. Ethan's heart pounded like a war drum in his chest. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The little girl, her little girl, stared up at Ava, oblivious to the storm raging in the air. Ava. His voice was barely a breath. Is she mine? Ava's lips parted, but no words came. She looked at him, and for the first time that night, her carefully built walls cracked. She didn't need to say it. Ethan already knew. His pulse roared in his ears as he looked at the child, his child. The delicate curve of her face, the way her dark curls framed her round cheeks. But it was her eyes that stole his breath. They were his. That same piercing shade of green, the same intensity. The air in the room felt too thin. Say something, he demanded, his voice rough. Ava's arms tightened protectively around the little girl. Not here. She turned, reaching for the child's hand, but Ethan stepped forward, his presence unshakable. No, he shook his head, anger and hurt crashing inside him like a tidal wave. You don't get to walk away again. Not this time. Ava flinched. The little girl, his daughter, watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. She tugged at Ava's sleeve. Mommy! The word sent a sharp pang through Ethan's chest. Mommy! How many times had she said that? How many moments had he missed? Ava knelt beside the girl, smoothing her curls with a tenderness that made Ethan's throat tighten. Sweetheart, go wait in the back for me, okay? The girl hesitated, her gaze flickering between Ava and Ethan. But who is he? Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He had no answer. Ava's expression turned unreadable. He's just someone I used to know. The words cut deeper than any blade. The little girl nodded slowly, then scampered off into the hallway. As soon as she was gone, Ethan turned to Ava, his emotions barely contained. You lied to me. His voice was low, shaking with restrained fury. For 6 years. Ava exhaled, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. That's the same damn thing. He ran a hand through his hair, his breath unsteady. You let me believe you were gone, that there was nothing left between us. And all this time, you were raising my daughter alone. Ava flinched at the accusation. I did what I had to do. What you had to do? His voice rose. Ava, I had a right to know. She had a right to know. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. And what would you have done, Ethan? Huh. She took a shaky step forward. You were too busy building your empire. Too busy proving yourself to the world. Where would we have fit in? Ethan clenched his jaw. I would have been there. Ava scoffed. No, you wouldn't have. You barely had time for me back then. How was I supposed to believe you'd have time for a child? Ethan's hands curled into fists. You didn't even give me the chance. She laughed bitterly, but it was filled with pain. You think it was easy for me? You think I wanted this? Her voice broke. I waited, Ethan. I waited for you to come after me. But you didn't. Ethan's breath hitched. The truth settled between them, heavy and inescapable. He had let her walk away. And now, he had lost more than just Ava. He had lost years. Years of a little girl's life that he would never get back. Ava wiped at her eyes, regaining her composure. I've done my best to give her a good life. It hasn't been perfect, but she's happy. She met his gaze, pleading. Please, Ethan. Don't turn this into a war. Ethan looked away, his chest tight. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar deals, bending the world to his will. But this? This was something he couldn't fix with power or money. This was his daughter. And he had no idea how to be her father. Silence stretched between them until Ava spoke again, softer this time. I never wanted to hurt you. Ethan let out a slow breath, his anger ebbing, replaced by something heavier. Something resembling regret. I don't know where to go from here, he admitted. Ava studied him, her own pain reflected in her eyes. Neither do I. And for the first time in years, neither of them had the answers. Ethan stood outside the small apartment building, his hands shoved deep into his pocket. The city hummed around him, cars passing, distant chatter filling the streets, but all he could focus on was the window on the third floor, dimly lit, a shadow moving behind the curtains. Ava was up there. His daughter was up there. The weight of it all still sat heavy on his chest. The years lost. The moments he had never even known to miss. He had spent so long believing his past with Ava was nothing more than a painful memory, buried beneath the rubble of ambition and regret. But now that past had a face, a name. Lily. She had barely spoken to him that night. Just small words. A quiet hi, a hesitant glance. She had clung to Ava's side, uncertain, not knowing who he was to her yet. And that was what shattered him the most. He was a stranger to his own child. The thought made his throat tighten, but before he could sink too far into it, the apartment door creaked open. Ava stepped out, pulling her coat tighter around herself. She hesitated when she saw him. "You're still here." "I told you," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'm not walking away." She let out a quiet breath, then walked down the few steps to stand beside him. The air between them wasn't as tense as before, but it was still fragile, still laced with things unsaid. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, side by side, watching the city move around them. Finally, Ava broke the silence. "She's asleep." Ethan nodded, his fingers curling into his palm. "She doesn't know who I am." Ava turned to face him. "She will." He met her gaze, searching for something, permission, maybe. Hope. "How do I even begin?" Ava sighed, glancing down at her hands. Slowly. Gently. She paused. "She's never had a father, Ethan. She doesn't know what that's supposed to look like." Guilt gnawed at him. "Because I wasn't there." Ava didn't argue. Didn't reassure him with words that weren't true. And he respected her for that. Instead, she said, "But you're here now." Ethan let the words settle. Here. Now. The past couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, the future could still be written. He exhaled and looked back up at the window, at the life he had almost never known. "I want to be in her life," he said quietly, the certainty solidifying inside him. Ava studied him, as if weighing the truth in his words. Then, finally, she nodded. "Then be in it. No contract. No negotiations. No conditions. Just a choice." Ethan had made billion-dollar decisions in minutes, had built an empire on risks and ruthless ambition. But this, choosing to stay, to be a father, to build something from nothing, this was the most important decision of his life. And for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he wanted. He turned back to Ava, the weight of years of pain, mistakes, and loss hanging between them. "I won't let her down," he promised. Ava's eyes softened, and for the first time that night she smiled. Not the guarded, tired smile she had given before, but something real. Something hopeful. "I know." And with that, the past finally loosened its grip, making room for something new.